The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Huge news weekend, and I'm glad you're with me today because we're now seeing sort of front and center the consequences of having a clueless and a sort of ADHD tendency president, specifically when it comes to war and the military. We already saw the consequences of an ignorant ADHD president with Obamacare, with tax cuts, with immigration, with diplomacy, with North Korea, and many other areas. And now we are seeing it with war, because Donald Trump approved a U.S. military strike in Iran, against Iran, as retaliation for Iran, as far as Trump believes, shooting down an American drone. This would have stepped us effectively into war with Iran, but then Donald Trump called it off last minute. This was happening, right? Planes were in the air, ships were in position, and then the command came to stand down. These would not have been strikes on Iranian drones. Trump approved of striking a bunch of missiles and radar sites. Our ally, the United Kingdom, was told about our plan ahead of time and not told about the cancellation until almost 3 hours after the cancellation took place. Why was the strike canceled? Trump says because he found out how many people would have died in that strike, tweeting, quote, "On Monday, they shot down," meaning Iran, "an unmanned drone flying in international waters. We were cocked and loaded to retaliate last night on 3 different sites. When I asked," by the way, I mean, this is just a mess. First of all, cocked and loaded, it's locked and loaded. Someone emailed me and said Cocked and Loaded is a gay porn film. I didn't verify that for myself, but it sounds like it could be. How does no one tell Trump that it's locked and loaded? And then he's talking about different sites, SIGHTS. Of course, he means sites as in locations, which is a different spelling. When I asked how many will die, 150 people, sir, was the answer from a general. 10 minutes before the strike, I stopped it. Not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone. I am in no hurry. Our military is rebuilt, new and ready to go. By far the best in the world. Sanctions are biting and more added last night. Iran can never have nuclear weapons, not against the USA and not against the world. This completely erratic ADHD foreign policy is a danger and an embarrassment. We're bombing people, we're not bombing people, all without even understanding anything and having caused this problem himself, most importantly. And now this has really brought some bad faith right-wingers out of the woodwork, because the discussion from some on the right has been, wait a second, you anti-war lefties are now criticizing Trump for not bombing Iran? This is the most bad faith discussion that I could imagine. I mean, just shut up. Seriously, you don't even deserve a seat at the table if that's going to be your argument. The problem is not that Donald Trump didn't bomb someone and I wanted them bombed. I don't want Trump bombing Iran in the same way that I don't want Trump getting involved in Venezuela or whatever else. The problem is Trump created this situation. He has no idea what he's doing. He ordered a strike without initially considering the civilian casualties. And then last minute, he's told 150 people will die. And then he says, oh, well, let's not do that, as opposed to asking in the beginning about civilian casualties. Civilian casualties, if it was a make or break for Trump, which do we believe that it was? I don't know. But if it was a make or break for Trump, it should have been asked about up front. The absurdity and the cost of launching this only to later discuss casualties and then call it off is ridiculous, it's embarrassing, and it's pathetic. Now, there are other possibilities if you don't believe that civilian casualties is actually the real explanation for Donald Trump calling this off. One general one is this some kind of 4D chess by Donald Trump, where he is wanting to convey willingness to do this, but then canceling it because he doesn't want the political repercussions, and he gets all the benefit of bombing Iran without the actual civilian casualties. No evidence of that. No evidence that Donald Trump is even capable of that type of abstract thought. So I don't buy that one. The second idea that's being floated, and I'm going to dig into this more tomorrow, is did Putin get in touch and say, don't bomb Iran? And that actually could relate to a lot of different things I want to discuss with you. One component is the idea, this actually goes back to the Marshall Plan, of the U.S. and Russia working together on nuclear, with Saudi Arabia being involved by putting a ton of money and ultimately getting nuclear technology out of the deal. Because there is a long-standing, there's a history about Saudi Arabia and nuclear weapons in the context of Russia and Iran. And the idea is that Trump backing out of the Iran deal to get Iran to restart enrichment, to justify attacking Iran, could all be a backdoor way to justify getting nuclear weapons for Saudi Arabia into the region. The Saudi Arabian royal family have previously said, if Iran gets them, we are getting them. So this is another entire idea as well. But again, I've not seen evidence that Donald Trump is capable of that type of abstract thought. Wouldn't be required if Putin or whoever just said, don't do it, don't bomb Iran. And there's an interesting growing theory that ultimately Donald Trump, despite his threats, will not attack Iran and will not get into Venezuela and will not do anything more in Syria, because not doing anything there in all three of those places would be what Putin would want. But we'll talk about that and analyze that more tomorrow. So here's what I came away with from this entire fiasco over the weekend. As center-right as Hillary Clinton is and was, and as much as I wanted someone much more progressive and voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 Democratic primary, consider that on three major bullet points alone, we would be much better off with Hillary Clinton than we are with Donald Trump. And this goes, I know that most people in our audience understand this, but there are still some people, some stragglers remaining in our audience who are of the Hillary Trump, it makes no difference to me sort of thing. Hillary Clinton was going to stay in the Iran deal, which Iran was complying with, which means Iran wouldn't now be resuming uranium enrichment, and she would not have ordered a strike on them and then called it back. Like, none of this would have happened with Iran if Hillary Clinton had been president. Number two, Hillary Clinton would have appointed two center-left Supreme Court justices who would now be on the court for decades, rather than two right-wing nuts like Donald Trump has done. That would have had decades of political implications. We would have been exponentially better off under Hillary Clinton than Donald Trump. And then number three, Hillary Clinton would not have willy-nilly started a trade war with China while cutting taxes on the rich and corporations, period. Yes, Hillary Clinton would have done things that I would not have liked. Yes, Hillary Clinton would have done things that would not have gone nearly far enough. She would have done some sprinkling of crumbs while the cake stays mostly in the same hands, much like Joe Biden would do. But on those three issues I just mentioned alone, trade, the Supreme Court, and this Iran stuff, we would be so much better off right now under Hillary Clinton than we are under Donald Trump. Disagree with me? Change my mind. I'm on Twitter at dpacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show, and we have just a massive program today. I will be talking about after the break about what is incredibly a debate. There's a debate now over whether caged children should have soap and bedding. Okay, that's a debate that is taking place in our country right now, thanks to the Trump Justice Department. I will also talk to you about these very disturbing revelations that Donald Trump threatened a reporter with prison over a photograph. And then later on in the program, there are new rape allegations against Donald Trump, barely covered in yesterday's Sunday shows. I'm going to get into that. And I have a 47-second video for you, 47 seconds of video that exposes the real Donald Trump. I'll explain all of this later on. Huge news weekend, and I'm glad you're with me today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Okay, let me say thanks to a couple of really great people. Today's new members of the day, membership, of course, the #1 funding source for the show. This is how we exist and grow. Tiffany Wilson is today's new member of the day, #1, and Thomas Andrade is today's new member, #2. Tiffany and Thomas, thank you. Really appreciate your support. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. And I also want to say thanks to somebody who's been with us for a while. Becoming a member is step 1. Staying a member is step 2. And that longtime support is what really allows us to make decisions of expansion on the basis of the recurring revenue that we anticipate coming in. And when folks stay with us for 5 years as members, like Ruben Aguilar has done, it really supports the show in an important and long-term way. So join everybody by signing up at www.joinpacman.com. I believe that the normal prices are extremely reasonable, $6 a month, $60 for the year. But if that is high, and I understand that for many in our audience it is, use the coupon code THISIS2020. That'll drop the price of a membership by 40%. You still keep all of the great member benefits. That's THISIS2020, all one word, all lowercase. Let's debate whether children kept in cages deserve things like beds and toothbrushes and soap. This is how far the Overton window has moved on the issue of child detentions and separations and incarcerations. Or to put it another way, this is how much creeping normality there has been on the issue of caging children. So let me explain those two terms because these are important. When I talk about the Overton window, when I say the Overton window has shifted on this issue, the Overton window is the range of what's acceptable for debate in the public discourse, okay? So for example, in the area of nuclear weapons, the Overton window, more or less, ranges from everybody who wants nukes should have nukes, or everyone should have nukes, sort of on one side, to no one should have nukes, and there should or shouldn't be international agreements limiting who has nukes, and there should or shouldn't be punishments like international sanctions for people, for countries that violate agreements on nukes. Okay, that's sort of all within the Overton window on nuclear weapons. Outside of the Overton window right now would be the position that if a country develops nuclear weapons when they shouldn't, we capture, torture, and kill the children of whoever is president or prime minister at the time. All right, that's a cartoonish example, but that is a position on nuclear weapons that is outside of the Overton window right now. It's not, when you hear that, you don't consider that to be part of what is the acceptable spectrum of debate or position on nuclear weapons. That's Overton window. Creeping normality is another term where you can't jump to where we are today. It has to creep in, slowly normalizing. So as an example, if 20 years ago someone had said, let's radicalize half the country on immigration so that they think brown people from Latin America are the enemy, who are taking our jobs and raping us, and then let's start putting children who come here with undocumented parents in cages, and we only have to debate, do those kids deserve soap and beds and toothbrushes? That would be too much. But that creeps in over 20 years, and here we are debating, do children in the custody of Border Patrol deserve, and are they entitled to, basic hygiene and bedding items? And in fact, we have a Trump Justice Department lawyer who recently insisted in court that safe and sanitary conditions is a vague term, and it may not include something as basic as a bar of soap or a toothbrush or a blanket for the fully lit cold rooms in which these children are forced to sleep, or at least try to sleep. Is being able to sleep at all part of safe and sanitary? Well, Trump's Justice Department lawyer, Sarah Fabian, argued it's not totally clear that it is. I'm going to play some of this video for you of the lawyer arguing with the judges. I'm going to show you several minutes of it so that you can see this wasn't a minor part of this hearing. This is an important and key part of the hearing. They are debating how should these children who have committed no crime, who were just brought here by their parents and have been taken into custody by Border Patrol, how should they be treated? And do they even deserve something like soap? Take a listen to what took place in a court just a few days ago.
But you're really going to stand up and tell us that being able to sleep isn't a question of safe and sanitary conditions?
Your Honor, I think what I'd like to stand up and
Not
say,
really gonna say
is to focus the court on what the question is. Any number of things might fall under those categories, and I think
yes, but sleep surely does, right? You can't be safe and sanitary or safe as a human being if you can't sleep.
Well,
and you said in your briefs it doesn't say anything about sleeping, so therefore there's nothing in here about being able to sleep.
I think the concern there is, Your Honor, the court finding that sleep, for example, is relevant to a finding of no safe and sanitary conditions is one thing, but the ultimate conclusion is safe and sanitary is a singular category in the agreement, and it was one has to assume left that way and not enumerated by the parties because either the parties couldn't reach agreement on how to enumerate that, or that it was left to the agencies to determine.
Or it was relatively obvious, and it's at least obvious enough so that if you're putting people into a crowded room to sleep on a concrete floor with an aluminum foil blanket on top of them, that doesn't comply with the agreement. I mean, it may be that they don't get super thread counts Egyptian linens. I get that. But the testimony that the district judge believed was, it's really cold. In fact, it gets colder when we complain about it being cold. We're forced to sleep crowded with the lights on all night long, and all you do put us on is the concrete floor with an aluminum blanket. I mean, I understand at some outer boundary there may be some definitional difficulty, but no one would argue that this is secure and sanitary, safe and sanitary. Or at least I don't think you're arguing that, are you?
Your Honor, I think what I'm arguing is that the way that the district court reached the conclusion was to say these specific items, and I think I will acknowledge, I think sleep is the more difficult end of what I'm arguing. When you start enumerating, for example, specific hygiene items, and the way that was done is that the court sort of enumerated these and say these fall under the rubric, these fall in the category of what could be required.
Again, it wasn't perfume soap, it was soap. It wasn't, high-class milled soap, it was soap. And that sounds to that's part of safe and sanitary. It's within everybody's common understanding that, if you don't have a toothbrush, if you don't have soap, if you don't have a blanket, it's not safe and sanitary. Well, wouldn't everybody agree to that? Do you agree to that?
Well, I think there's fair reason to find that those things may be part of safe and sanitary.
Maybe, are a part. What do you say maybe?
This is what it sounds like, okay? We're debating, does a 6-year-old separated from his or her parents through no fault of their own and put in a crowded, crappy facility, do they get soap? Do they get a blanket despite having the lights on all night and being super cold and being in close proximity with other people, making basic hygiene even more important to prevent the spread of disease and germs? This is the debate that we are having not only in our legal system, but also in the political world, because there are Trumpists who are on apparently the side of the lawyer, that it's not clear that these children who have done nothing wrong deserve these things. Now, I know lots of lawyers, and I understand you argue for your client. I've met George Zimmerman's lawyer and spent some time with him, and I've gotten an interesting perspective of his view on this issue of he doesn't have to like George Zimmerman to believe that George Zimmerman deserves a defense, but then it starts to get more complicated when you get into some of these specific situations. You argue for your client, not necessarily for what you believe. But how does this woman sleep at night? Everything that is taking place here is completely backwards. And I hate to even go to a financial argument, because for me, the moral argument and the legal argument are so obvious here. But to make a financial argument, isn't it much cheaper to spend some money on soap and blankets and toothbrushes and prevent the types of illness and disease that would spread if kids can't sleep and can't clean themselves? Isn't that much cheaper than having to treat the diseases and conditions that would arise from no hygiene in such crowded and concentrated situations? Although maybe the whole point is they don't really have a plan of treating those conditions anyway. And secondly, if you look at what it costs to keep these kids detained, and estimates range from $300 a day up to $750 a day or more, how are we not able to just obviously afford and have the soap and bedding on hand? Which is why this gets to, I don't actually think that the financial issue is the issue. This gets back to that strict father morality I've spoken about before, which is it doesn't matter if we can afford it. It doesn't matter if even legally there's a case to be made that these basic hygiene products should be provided to these kids. There is a contingent in this country that on a moral level believes that children whose parents came to the United States illegally or came to the border legally seeking asylum, that the children as a result don't deserve soap when the United States decides to enforce and carry out a policy of putting these kids in what are effectively cages. And there are other terms we could even use when we talk about the crowded conditions. It is absolutely stunning that this is a debate that we're having, but this is how the discourse has gone in the United States over the last 20 years. The Overton window has shifted. There has been creeping normalization of this stuff. And this is where we are in 2019. And it doesn't bode well for us as a society, doesn't bode well for us as an economy, doesn't bode well for us as a country. It's sad and depressing, but this is the reality today. There are few attacks on the freedom of an independent press that are more chilling than threatening reporters with prison time. And we just learned that Donald Trump has done exactly that. This is truly a disturbing act that it would be great to see it cross party lines. It should scare every single one of us, and that includes Republicans and Democrats. And it would be great to see both Republicans and Democrats that are our elected officials call this out. But in the world in which we exist today, of haphazard and knee-jerk defenses of anything that Donald Trump says or does, I don't think we're going to see it, okay? You might remember that Donald Trump once had this letter that Kim Jong-un sent him. I think he might have called it a beautiful letter or something like that. Donald Trump had reporters in the room at that time, and he may have asked to go off the record in terms of the contents or maybe not. And he held up the letter. And from what we have learned so far, a reporter from Time magazine held up his camera to take a picture. And Donald Trump said, and it's sort of confusing and muddled and erratic, like a lot of what Donald Trump says, but what Trump said, according to the transcript, is, excuse me, under Section 2, well, you can go to prison instead, because if you use the photograph you took of the letter that I gave you, and Time tries to continue talking about the topic of the interview, do you believe that people should be, and Trump interrupts, confidentially, I didn't give it to you to take photographs of it, so don't play that game with me. Let me just tell you something. You take a look. Time says, I'm sorry, Mr. President, were you threatening me with prison time? And Trump says, well, I told you the following. I told you can look at this off the record. That doesn't mean you take out your camera and start taking pictures of it, okay? So I hope you don't have a picture of it. I know you were very quick to pull it out. Even you were surprised to see that. You can't do that stuff. So go have fun with your story, because I'm sure it will be the 28th horrible story I have in Time magazine, because it's incredible. With all I've done and the success I've had, the way that Time magazine writes is absolutely incredible. Fascinatingly, this riled him up so much that he then went into a huge rant about no collusion, no obstruction as a result of a photographer taking a picture. It is just so incredible to read a transcript of Donald Trump scolding a reporter for taking a picture of something that Trump gave confidentially, which he doesn't even understand the meaning of, while he has given up secrets from allies to Russians in the Oval Office. I mean, it's a jarring juxtaposition of what Trump says and what Trump does. And it's really important to understand here, when Trump says he gave something confidentially, confidential is a classification of documents. You can't just yell out, this is confidential, or, this pen is top secret, and make it so. And it's also really important to understand that it's Trump who shouldn't be showing things to people who don't have the correct clearances. And more importantly, Trump and his aides, remember, have bragged endlessly about how Trump can declassify anything he wants by showing it to whoever he wants. If Trump shows someone the picture, then he has decided that it's okay for them to see it. It's also really funny that Trump mentioned Section 2, and then he seemed to realize he didn't know what he was talking about. Let's put the transcript back up on the screen for a moment. Trump started to say, excuse me, under Section 2, and then he kind of went away from that and said, well, you can go to prison instead. I guess he means Article 2 of the Constitution, or maybe Section 2 of Article 2. During this same confused interview, he seemed to be using the term Section 2 and Article 2 kind of interchangeably, like maybe they're the same thing and he doesn't know what he's talking about. Article 2 has two sections of the Constitution. Section 1 establishes basically how the president and vice president are to be elected and serve four-year terms. Section 2 of Article 2 talks about the president being the head of the executive branch of government and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Who on earth knows what Donald Trump was talking about when he mentioned Section 2 and then Article 2? But at least at some point, he seemed to have the presence of mind to realize he doesn't actually know what the hell he's talking about. This is Trump, though, okay? When he was in private business, he would threaten to sue anyone in business that he didn't like. That was his strategy. And based on what we know from Michael Cohen, his former personal attorney, that was a pretty effective strategy. Sicking Michael Cohen, the attack dog, on people with threats of lawsuits was a pretty effective way to get compliance from the people he wanted to get compliance from. Now he's threatening people with prison because he's president of the United States. It is truly chilling to see him wave prison time around to reporters in this way. And I know that there will be Trumpists who see this and say, David, it was a vague threat. He's generally talking about prison. Freedom of the press is one of the most important speech freedoms that we have in this country. And a president threatening or even mentioning prison to a reporter in this way is unheard of, except in extremely authoritarian dictatorial circles. And that is exactly what Donald Trump aspires to. And that's why this is so chilling and dangerous. Let me know what you think. Make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pacman. Make sure while you're there, you follow the show on Instagram at David Pacman Show.
The David Pacman Show at davidpacman.com. Welcome back to the David Pacman Show.
It's great to welcome to the program today Richard Griffiths, who's president of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, an organization that's dedicated to encouraging open government, free expression, and independent journalism. So great to talk to you, Richard. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So listen, we've been talking at the federal level about what I've been seeing as red flags when it comes to press freedom. And this, a lot of it has been coming from the Oval Office. It includes everything from threats of making it easier to sue media outlets, journalism licenses, refusal of interview or even spots in the press room at the White House based on the sort of perceived friendliness to the administration. But it's not just at the federal level that there are things happening when it comes to press freedom. A lot of stuff, as in many other areas, seems to be happening at the state level. Is that right?
I would argue that that's probably true too, although there's probably less chance for traction at the state level, although you can certainly throw up a lot of impediments.
Let's talk, I was going to say the Ethics in Journalism Act specifically in Georgia is something that many people probably have not heard of, but which would have a significant impact on journalists' work.
Well, this was a bill dropped right at the end of the legislative session. It became public on the 2nd of April, which was the last day, and was filed on the 1st. And I thought it was an April Fool's joke initially. But what it proposed was a journalism oversight board, a board appointed initially by the chancellor of the University of Georgia, the board to be based at the very prestigious Grady College of Journalism at UGA, to be made up of 3 editors, 3 news producers, 2 web journalists, and 1 retired journalism professor. And the bill suggests that the folks there, the 9 folks, would create a canon of standards for journalism and accredit journalists within the state and enforce the professional standards for journalism in the state. The bill would also require that all outtakes from interviews, such as this one, would have to be provided to the interviewee within 3 days of a request. So outtakes, interview notes, all photographs. It's sort of a harassment measure against existing journalism. And in a not so subtle dig at journalists, the bill would require that the journalists turn over the outtakes and photographs within 3 days, which is precisely the same period that government in Georgia has to respond to the Open Records Act. There's no way, thankfully, that this bill will pass At least I don't think it can pass. And even if it did pass, the governor of Georgia has said that he won't sign it. And I doubt there would be enough votes to sustain it. But it does present a really interesting insight into what I describe as the zeitgeist now in the country. You know, this bill was proposed by 6 really well-educated people who are respected in the legislature. There's a former missionary who also works as a contractor. There's a pharmacist. There's a doctor, a lawyer, a retired county agent who's chair of the education committee. And there's a real estate developer behind this. They're all Republican. They're, as I said, well thought of. They come from predominantly rural areas. And 10 years ago, they would have been the laughingstock for pushing a bill like this. Now, I think the tone has changed so much, such that there's such, on the Republican side, such disdain for mainstream media that they have a pass to do it. And probably when they went back to their districts, they got slaps on the backs and attaboys. And that is a really disturbing trend. If you look at the latest Edelman Trust survey that came out in January, it's a global survey with an amazing 0.6 margin of error. And in the U.S., 69% of Democrats are said to trust the media, but only 23% of Republicans. Now, that is a startling disconnect, and that's the thing that scares me the most here, and really is why bills like this can come up and get traction.
Yeah, I mean, there's this, earlier in the program, we talked about this in regard to the debate that is going on as to whether children who are being kept in what are effectively large cages at the border deserve soap and bedding, where there's a creeping normalization. If 20 years ago you try to jump right to that part of the debate, you get no traction whatsoever. But over time, as the sort of Overton window is pushed a little more and more in a particular direction, then all of a sudden it seems, at least in some circles, reasonable to debate something like the accreditation of journalists.
Well, I think this is not just a U.S. issue. I do a lot of work in Eastern Europe, helping news organizations there deal with threats against their operations. And particularly in Poland, you see efforts there to control the press. And there it started with adjustments into the constitution of the courts and who could be a judge and how long one could stay a judge. So existing judges who had lots of experience were removed, and then the judges who were put in were much more hostile to a free press. And there the independent journalists are under assault for their ownership, because some of them are American-owned, some of them have partial German ownership. And so the attacks come as a sort of a licensing component. But it is all about the threat to the government that independent journalism presents. And when the government in question is hanging on by a thread, as is the case in Poland, they have a very narrow majority. So the efforts to constrain the press become more vigorous. Now, I don't want to draw too many comparisons to Georgia, but Georgia, for the first time, is a state in play. And I suspect that also comes as part of it here. You have folks who are really wanting to pump up their base and wanting to get folks really enthusiastic and out in the polls. And the media, frankly, is the bogeyman for a lot of Republicans. And it's easy to charge people up and get people fired up. by attacking a free and independent press.
Yeah, it's been incredibly successful to use this fake news term to basically become a catch-all for anything that contradicts the pre-existing narrative that may exist in some political circles or that is critical of the current administration. And what's most disturbing to me is not that this is something that the current administration has attempted, but the success that has come with it. I mean, you know, the number of tweets and YouTube comments that I get daily saying that my program is fake news is probably not altogether surprising, because whatever is kind of in the insult of the day, I am the recipient of. But the serious way in which, as you point out, it has affected particularly Republican voters into believing that at some fundamental level, basic news reporting cannot be trusted, that partisan divide is what shows me how effective it's been.
Well, I think there's another thing that journalists like us have to look at each other in the face and say, we have allowed ourselves to become too siloed. And part of the breakdown in trust is that we have not necessarily have been as transparent as we should be about our processes.
That's interesting. In what sense do you mean?
Well, I think that the public often look at large journalism institutions and they don't know how the magic happens. They don't know the amount of work that goes into reporting out a news story. How many calls got made, how many documents were examined, how many FOIA requests were made, how many efforts were made to get somebody who didn't speak to speak. And we're not transparent enough about that process. There's a terrific initiative coming out of the University of Georgia and Poynter, the Trusting News Initiative, where they're actively working to coach news organizations to push openness and transparency, even goes so far in some newsrooms to open up their editorial meetings to Facebook Live so people can see how those editorial discussions go. How is the newspaper going to be stacked tomorrow? What's going to be the lead story? What stories are they choosing and why are they choosing those stories? At CNN, when I was there was a lot of action on our part towards explaining why we did stories and how we did them and what the process was for reporting out those stories. Those are all the kinds of things that help build trust. But as I say earlier, it's one step. It's not the total solution. We've got to figure out other ways of winning back that trust.
I agree 100%. I think the other side of this, and I'd be curious to hear your thought about it in the limited time we have, is the lack of media literacy that we increasingly have in this country. I recently adjunct taught a course on critical thinking and new media at Boston College, and a huge component of it was just explaining to students what the differences are between something like fake news and something like simply that there is editorial bias in a story, and being able to distinguish between news and opinion journalism, understanding that anonymous source doesn't necessarily mean anonymous to the journalist, but it is a source's identity that may be kept private from the public perspective. All of these basic things to me seem to be completely missing from education right now.
I completely agree with that. I teach at the University of North Carolina each year, and there's an intro course that's a big survey course taught by the dean that I help with. And those kids are everything from pre-meds to future journalism major to chemistry majors who, have to fulfill some preliminary requirements. And they're very startled to hear that what journalists actually do know the names of sources, precisely the point. But also, we as journalists need to be much more careful about how we identify our guest. Is the person who's on the air a reporter delivering a report?
Yes. Or
like me, somebody who's giving their opinion on journalism based on years of experience. So I'm certainly an opinion person. I'm not a reporter, although I played that role in my career. So identifying who we have on the air, who the people are in the stories providing their expertise is absolutely critical.
Yes. Well, on that note, Richard Griffiths is president of the Georgia First Amendment Foundation, and he has been here giving us his opinion on the basis that he has informed that opinion personally and not here as a reporter. Richard, really appreciate your time today on this really important issue.
Thank you for having me on.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
There is a new sexual assault allegation against Donald Trump, in addition to the, 12 or 16 that already exist. And this is a really bad one. This is an allegation of rape. Now, I think because of the creeping normalization that we've experienced in the United States under Donald Trump for the last couple of years, it's crazy I have to mention this, but even one instance of something like this for Barack Obama would have been a 24/7 scandal on corporate and right-wing media for weeks at least, but it was almost completely ignored by the Sunday morning talk shows and got relatively little coverage over the weekend. First of all, we are talking here about magazine advice columnist and former Miss Indiana University, E. Jean Carroll, who has accused Donald Trump of attacking her and raping her at a New York department store in the late 1990s. Carroll says that she ran into Trump in the fall of 95 or spring of 96 at the Bergdorf Goodman department store in New York City, where she says he attacked her in one of the dressing rooms, claims that Donald Trump pressured her to try on lingerie, grabbed her arm to pull her towards the dressing room, and then I will read her quote, and I warn you, it is extremely graphic and disturbing. Quote, "The moment the dressing room door is closed, he lunges at me, pushes me against the wall, hitting my head quite badly, and puts his mouth against my lips. I am so shocked, I shove him back and start laughing again. He seizes both my arms and pushes me up against the wall a second time. And as I become aware of how large he is, he holds me against the wall with his shoulder and jams his hand under my coat dress and pulls down my tights. I'm astonished by what I'm about to write. I keep laughing. The next moment, still wearing correct business attire, shirt, tie, suit, jacket, overcoat, he opens the overcoat, unzips his pants, and forcing his fingers around my private area, thrusts his penis halfway or completely, I'm not certain, inside me." This is an allegation of rape. She's alleging that she was raped by Donald Trump. Now, Trump has denied it, says he has no idea who the woman is. A picture has since been published of Donald Trump with the accuser, E. Jean Carroll, and close to total silence about this on the Big Five Sunday talk shows. ABC, CBS, CNN, MSNBC, and Fox all have these Sunday talk shows. Mike Pence was interviewed. Bernie Sanders was interviewed. No mentions of the new rape allegations against Donald Trump. So a couple things to talk about here. First of all, if the corporate media were all as liberally biased as Donald Trump and Republicans and Trump's sycophants claim corporate media to be liberally biased, this would have been a topic of discussion yesterday, period. Number two, the hypocrisy of Republicans who uniformly jump behind any allegation, no matter who makes it, against Democrats, like, for example, against Bill Clinton, Juanita Broderick in 1999, or whoever else. They now are ignoring more than a dozen allegations against Donald Trump. If this is mere politics, why couldn't some of the allegations against Bill Clinton have been given the same benefit of the doubt as they are providing to the allegations against Donald Trump? But in any other presidency, it's really important to understand this would be front page news nonstop, period. Now, I would also be curious to know, asking all the people who hated Barack Obama and thought he was the worst person in the world, that he had committed all sorts of crimes, that he was, in some cases, a shape-shifting antichrist, that he was planning to declare martial law and suspend the 2016 election to try to stay in power indefinitely. Why is it that no one thought to concoct sexual assault allegations against Barack Obama? I mean, not only are there not sexual assault allegations against Barack Obama, there are not even what we could call political sexual assault allegations against Barack Obama. And for those who say this is a tactic that the left uses against Republicans, fake sexual assault allegations, why were there no sexual assault allegations against Republican President George W. Bush? So the point is, it's not based in fact to claim every president has sexual assault accusers and they're widely understood to be fake and attempts to take down presidents. No, most presidents do not have sexual assault allegations levied against them. And Donald Trump having 12 or 15 or 18, I don't even know what the number is at this point, including, remember, child rape allegations, which I have covered, but have not received nearly enough attention. This is different, okay? It is not even remotely reasonable to say presidents, they always have all sorts of sexual assault allegations against them. No, Barack Obama didn't. George W. Bush didn't. Now, as far as the corporate media coverage, is this not getting coverage because even the reporters and the media have become totally numb to and desensitized to Donald Trump's treatment of women? Is it that they have calculated that there is little upside to covering the 17th or the 19th or whatever allegation because the first 12 or 15 or 17 didn't get traction? What do you think is going on here? Is what's going on as shocking and disturbing as that, or is there something else that is preventing this from getting coverage? There has been a ton of press around Donald Trump's interview with George Stephanopoulos on ABC News last week, and I already talked a lot about the politics in the interview, the things Trump said, the incorrect allegations and assertions that Donald Trump made. But there is a 47-second section of this interview that isn't getting nearly the discussion it deserves, which exposes what I consider to be the real Donald Trump, the truly terrible, toxic, bad person that Donald Trump is to be around. And this is kind of buried in part 3 of the interview with George Stephanopoulos. What ABC News did is divide the interview into 3 parts. The first 2, I think, are each about 12 or 13 minutes long. And part 3, at least as I saw it divided up on the ABC News YouTube channel, is much shorter. And in part 3, George Stephanopoulos is pressing Donald Trump about his financial disclosures. And Trump is going into one of these nonsense talking point rants that he gives, which are never really answers. They often contradict. The thing he says in the first 15 seconds contradicts the thing he says in the second 15 seconds. He says he won't release his financial disclosure, but he hopes that eventually people see it, even though he could release it any time. And in the midst of Donald Trump talking about this, there's a cough in the background, okay? And Trump stops talking, and the look on his face changes. He looks all of a sudden rabid, and he says he wants to do it over again because his chief of staff is coughing in the background. Now, it's actually pretty interesting that ABC News even included this in the final cut because Trump asked for it to be redone, and then he redoes his answer with equally nonsensical talking points. But when you hear him talking about the cough in the background, when you see the look on his face, when you hear the vitriol and the toxicity in his voice, Trump sounds like he thinks the people around him, including his chief of staff who coughed, are just worthless, barely human forms of life. And this is the Trump we've thought was the real Trump. From all of the reports about him, from former employees, former campaign officials, from reports about his relationships with his own families, his own family members, and with his various mistresses and women he's had affairs with. The audio tells us a lot. It's better if you're watching this so that you also see the anger and the disgust on Donald Trump's face. Someone coughing. This is a brief appearance of the real Donald Trump, which I believe Trump didn't think would ultimately be published as part of the interview. But still, if you're even willing to treat people like this in front of George Stephanopoulos and an entire ABC crew, plus your own staff and security, how is he behaving in more truly private settings? Take a look at these 47 seconds of video.
Much, much bigger, much better than anybody. They're after my financial statement. The Senate, they'd like to get my financial statement. At some point, I hope they get it.
You're going to turn it over?
No, at some point, I might. But at some point, I hope they get it because it's a fantastic financial statement. It's a fantastic financial statement. And let's do that over. He's coughing in the middle of my answer.
Yeah, okay.
I don't like that, you know?
Your chief of staff.
If you're going to cough, please leave the room.
Get a shot of, and I'll come over here.
You just can't.
Just to change the shot.
Okay.
Sorry, Mr.
Okay, do you want to do that a little differently then?
Yeah, we just changed the angle. Okay. Yep. Thank you.
So at some point, I look forward to, frankly, I'd like to have people see my financial statement.
There's a literal Jekyll and Hyde transformation that you see on Donald Trump's face when Mulvaney coughs. Trump stops playing the character that he's playing in the interview, and he becomes the real Trump. And by the way, what does it even mean that it's a financial statement that's fantastic? And if it's so good, why isn't Trump going to publish it? That's a whole other discussion to be had. But this is the real Trump. He is a terrible person. He has no empathy for anyone, period. He's horrible to be around. He's self-centered to the absolute maximum. He could have indicated that he didn't like the cough and he wanted to do it over by saying, sorry, George, 1 second. Mick, are you okay? And done it over again. Any non-narcissist would have behaved completely differently here. And this is one of the most disturbing parts of the interview, as Donald Trump sits there with pure malice in his eyes for his own chief of staff. It was actually suggested, and this makes it even more interesting, it was suggested that Trump was making such a fool of himself with his answer on this financial disclosure issue to George Stephanopoulos that Mulvaney might have coughed deliberately to ruin what Trump was saying because it was so stupid and dumb in order to give Trump an out. And if that's true, and we don't know if it is, that would actually make Donald Trump's treatment of Mulvaney even more stunning, even though it wouldn't surprise me that Donald Trump simply wouldn't be smart enough to realize that Mulvaney was trying to help Trump and trying to get him out of trouble. In any case, that's the real Donald Trump. That is the real Donald Trump, who is an absolute disgrace and nightmare to work for, exposed very briefly in 47 seconds of audio and video. I encourage you to watch the entire interview because the whole thing is a pathetic gong show. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here's something that I get a lot, okay? And this is a caller who seems to have built up an entire false reality in their mind. Take a listen to this.
Hey, David, my name is Michael. I've been calling into you and Sam Cedar and as well as Michael Brooks for a little bit. I feel like you're all kind of a little bit nervous to debate me because I'm a conservative. You know, I have differing viewpoints. Maybe I'm a little bit more convincing. You know, if you're open to a debate, open to, open exchange of ideas in the marketplace of ideas, feel free to, give me a call back.
What is this person talking about, right? I mean, sadly, this type of thing is more common than you might think. I regularly get calls from people who believe that there is a whole sort of thing going on that I have no clue who this person is. So what do they mean that he gets the sense that I'm very nervous to debate him because he's a conservative? I mean, it's just, I genuinely don't know where to feel bad. And I don't want to make fun of this person because some people do call into the show who actually are mentally ill and they're very disconnected from reality. And that's, that's sad. And I don't want to be making fun of that. But we've had people who believe I'm sort of discreetly sending them messages through the show subliminally, that there's a subtext to what's going on, that I'm addressing the show to them specifically, that I'm calculating what to say in order not to upset them or to upset them in some cases. It's actually sad. I don't know who this person is. I don't know what they're talking about, that I and other hosts are nervous about debating them. If you want to challenge me about something, we take live calls every week. They aren't screened. Any conservative can get on anytime they want and challenge me about whatever they want. I'm not nervous and I welcome that. But I think that there's a sort of fantasy land element to what's going on here. And whether it's quirky or funny or sad or disturbing or concerning, I don't really know. But I don't know who you are, and I'm not nervous about debating you, and I encourage you to call in absolutely anytime. We've got a great bonus show for you today. Things are not going well in the Dominican Republic as a 10th American has died. We're going to talk about that, as well as what appears to be a bogus study related to smartphones and the idea of sending astronauts back to the moon by 2024, just 4 years away. Is that possible? Is it feasible? All of those stories and more on the bonus show today. Sign up at www.joinpacman.com.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.